The firelight flickers, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls of this bedchamber. It's late. You can hear the distant howl of a dog, the wind sighing through a crack in the shutters. You're lying on a mattress, or at least what passes for one. It's a sack, really stuffed with straw, and it rustles with every slight shift of your weight. The wool blanket, heavy and scratchy, is a small comfort against the chill that seems to seep through everything. Beside you, someone stirs, and you can feel their breath warm on your neck. You're here in a medieval bedroom, and you're wondering, what did lovers say to each other? What secrets did they whisper when the world outside was dark and full of superstition? You'd be forgiven for thinking it was a world of knights and ladies of flowery sonnets and chaste adoration. And yes, that was a part of it, the stuff of troubadours and courtly love poems. But the reality was a lot more human, and sometimes a lot less romantic. Because while the poets were busy crafting verses about unattainable beauty, the people in this bed, and millions of others just like it, were navigating a world of practicality, fear, and a deep, abiding hope for connection. Let's start with the basics, the language itself. You're not speaking the crisp modern English, you know. You're likely whispering in something like Middle English, a tongue full of guttural sounds and words that might sound to your ears like a strange blend of German and modern slang. A word like love might be luff, and to call someone your dear heart might be der hurt. It's a language that feels both familiar and alien, and it forces you to slow down, to choose your words carefully. So what might they say? Maybe something as simple and profound as "I am cold." And the response could be a practical one, a shifting of bodies to share warmth. Or perhaps something more tender, like a hand reaching out in the dark. The medieval world was a harsh place, and simple comforts were profound. Warmth food, a safe place to sleep, these were not guaranteed. And to share them was a powerful act of trust. Then there were the secrets, the whispered fears. Did you hear the news from the next village? A plague has taken root. The harvest is failing. Did you lock the door against the wild animals that prowl the woods? Life was a constant negotiation. With peril and the safety of the bed, the intimate space you shared was a refuge. So the whispers would have been a catalog of worries and hopes of plans for the next day, pleas to God for protection. But what about the lovers, the ones who were not bound by the practicalities of a marriage contract? What did they say? Well, a quirky historical tidbit for you. Scholars have found evidence of medieval graffiti, crude drawings and messages scratched into walls, often in public places. The kind of stuff that would make a modern city council blush. They show us that people were just as prone to declaring their love or their lust in public as we are today. One such inscription, found in a ruined French castle, simply says, "I love the beautiful one." No flowery prose, just a declaration. It's a testament to the fact that for all the formal structures of society, the basic impulse to express affection was just as strong then as it is now. So perhaps in the bedchamber, the whispers were equally direct, simple declarations of desire, unadorned by the conventions of courtly love. Of course, the church had something to say about all this whispering. Mainstream historical fact, the church exerted an immense amount of control over medieval life, and that extended right into the bedroom. They laid out strict rules about when and how a couple could have sex. No sex on feast days, no sex on Sundays, no sex during Lent. The list was long and complex, and frankly a bit of a mood killer, so some of the whispering would have been a quiet negotiation of these rules. Is it Sunday yet? We can't. What about tomorrow? It sounds absurd to us, but for them it was a very real part of their lives, a line they couldn't cross without risking eternal damnation. This leads to a really interesting debate among historians. Did people actually follow these rules? Or did they just go to confession on Saturday and hope for the best? The phrase, historians still argue whether, comes to mind here because the evidence is thin. We have the rules, but we have very few personal accounts from the average person that tell us if they were adhered to. You can imagine the conversation, though. Maybe a whispered joke about the priest, a quiet rebellion against the endless restrictions, a shared defiance in the face of a rigid world. Maybe the most intimate whisper was a shared secret, a small transgression against a powerful authority. So you lie there on your straw mattress, the scratchy blanket pulled to your chin. You listen to the breathing beside you, and you realize that the medieval bedroom wasn't so different after all. It was a place of secrets and comforts, of fears and desires, of small, quiet moments that added up to a life. The words may have been different, the context strange, but the human heart, it seems, hasn't changed all that much. The whispers in the dark, the shared vulnerabilities, they are a language we all still understand. You shift on your straw mattress, the rustling, a surprisingly loud protest in the quiet room. It's not just the mattress that's uncomfortable. It's the sheer novelty of the whole situation. You're not just in a medieval bedroom. You're in a medieval bed. And this, you quickly realize, is a far more complex and communal space than you ever imagined. Forget the pristine private sanctuary you're used to. This bed, this room, is a social hub, a place where people lived, not just slept. First, let's talk about the bed itself. The one you're on, the straw-stuffed sack, is a pretty common reality for the vast majority of people, the peasants and common laborers. It's hard lumpy and probably home to more than a few critters you don't want to think about. The wealthy, of course, had it better. They might have a bedstead, a wooden frame with ropes strung across it to support the mattress. Historians still argue whether these ropes were comfortable or just a way to keep you off the cold floor, but either way, they were a step up. The mattress would be filled with feathers or wool, a luxury for sure. And the sheets, if you had them, were made of linen, a soft and delicate fabric. But even in a lord's castle, the bedchamber wasn't a private retreat. You see, a quirky tidbit about medieval beds is that they were often shared. Not just with your spouse, but with your children, your servants, or even your guests. If you were a noble, your bed was probably in the main hall of the castle, a grand four-poster draped with curtains to give you a semblance of privacy. And during a feast or a party, the space around your bed could be full of people. So imagine trying to have a private, romantic moment while your page is snoring at the foot of your bed and a handful of servants are sleeping on the floor nearby. The concept of a private, intimate bedroom was a slow and late invention. It's a very modern notion, the idea that a bedroom is a space just for you. So in the dark, you might not just be whispering to your lover, you might be whispering to a whole host of people. And the whispers might be practical, not romantic. Did you see the Lord's face when the jester told that joke? Or maybe, don't forget to wake me before dawn so I can get to the fields. The bed was a place of conversation, of family decisions, of social hierarchy. The best spot or the warmest spot was always a topic of quiet negotiation. Let's not forget the sensory details, the smell of the room. It's not just the straw you're lying on. It's the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace, of unwashed bodies of damp earth from the floor, and the ever-present scent of animals who often lived in the same building as their owners. It's a rich, earthy tapestry of smells that would overwhelm you if you weren't already so tired. And the sounds, the snores of others, the wind, the creaks of the old building, the occasional squeak of a mouse. It's a symphony of a shared life. Now let's bring it back to the more intimate moments. How did lovers in this crowded space find a way to be alone? Well, they had to be creative. A mainstream historical fact is that couples often waited until everyone else was deeply asleep. They might use a code, a light touch on the hand, a certain phrase to signal their intentions. The privacy wasn't physical. It was a matter of shared secrecy. The language of the bedroom was less about what you said and more about what you didn't say, the gestures, the quiet movements. It was a language of shadows and silence. But even with all these people around, there was a certain comfort in the collective. Remember that feeling of being alone in the wilderness, the fear. Well, here you are, never truly alone. The people in your bed, in your room, are your community, your safety net. They are the ones who will wake you if a fire starts or if a thief tries to break in. It's a trade-off, a loss of privacy for a gain in security. And in a world that could be terrifyingly dangerous, that was a pretty good deal. There's a gentle sarcasm in the idea of a medieval romantic getaway. It would probably just be you and your significant other crammed in with a bunch of other people in a tiny smoky hut, whispering sweet nothings while trying to ignore the rooster crowing just outside the door. And yet this closeness, this enforced intimacy, may have made their connection stronger. You couldn't retreat to separate rooms after an argument. You had to work things out to share the same space, the same air, the same straw-filled mattress. The shared life wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. And maybe, just maybe, that necessity forged a deeper bond. So as you lie here, feeling the lumps in your mattress and the presence of others around you, you begin to appreciate that this isn't just a bed. It's a small, crowded world, and in that world, love finds a way. The darkness in the chamber is absolute. Now the last embers of the fire having finally given up their ghost. But in your mind's eye, a different kind of light begins to glow, a light from the grand halls of castles and the manicured gardens of noble courts. You're no longer just in a peasant's hut. You're an observer, a quiet listener to the whispers that went far beyond the bedroom. You're hearing the echoes of something called courtly love. It's a term that probably makes you think of knights on white horses serenading damsels in distress with lutes and sonnets. And honestly, you're not far off. But this wasn't just some romantic ideal. It was a highly codified, almost ritualistic system. A mainstream historical fact here is that courtly love as a concept was often a deeply platonic and public affair. A knight would profess his undying eternal love for a married noblewoman, and she would in turn be his inspiration, his muse. Their love was a spiritual quest, a path to virtue and honor. The funny thing, the whole thing was generally expected to be unconsummated. It was all about the longing, the adoration from afar. The love was a secret code, a performance for the public eye that was really just a thinly veiled social contract. You were showing off your virtue, your refinement, your emotional depth. It was in a way the medieval equivalent of posting a really aesthetically pleasing selfie with a deep emotional caption. Look how sensitive and cultured I am. Now let's talk about those love songs and poems. You can imagine a knight in the moonlight strumming a lute and singing a ballad to his lady's window. And while that's not totally wrong, the songs were often full of secret codes and hidden meanings. They weren't just singing about how pretty her eyes were. They were using a complex vocabulary of symbols and metaphors. A rose might not just be a rose, it could be a symbol of secret desire. A bird might represent a hidden messenger. You had to know the code to understand the message. It's a bit like trying to decipher modern text abbreviations without a guide. WIDIDK, love you. Confusing, right? Well, medieval poetry was just as cryptic and a whole lot more poetic, and this is where a quirky little tidbit comes in. A group of scholars called the troubadours, who were essentially traveling rock stars of the medieval world, were the main purveyors of this poetry. They would travel from court to court, singing their songs of love and longing. Some of these troubadours were women known as troubadourittes, who wrote from a female perspective, which was pretty revolutionary for the time. They were often more direct and less idealized in their poetry, speaking of passion and desire in a way the male troubadours usually didn't. They were the original voice of female desire in a world that mostly preferred women to be silent and chaste. So while the knight was singing about his unblemished love, the lady might have been writing a poem about how she was going to run away with her lover and live happily ever after. A much more practical and, dare I say, romantic approach. But the most fascinating thing about this whole courtly love tradition is the ambiguity. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever truly a chaste and platonic affair, or if it was just an elaborate cover for secret, very physical relationships. Was it a genuine spiritual path, or just a sophisticated system for having an affair under the nose of a husband? It's a debate that's still going on and will probably never have a definitive answer. The evidence is all in the poetry, and poetry, as you know, is a master of disguise. It tells you what it wants you to believe, not necessarily what is true. So you can picture it now. A noble couple sitting in the great hall surrounded by their court. The knight is singing a song to his lady, a song full of metaphors about roses and nightingales. Everyone in the room is smiling and nodding, appreciating the beauty of the poetry. But the husband sitting next to her is just as in the dark as everyone else. And the lady, with a slight knowing smile on her face, is silently communicating a very different message back to the knight. It's all a performance, a grand theatrical play in which everyone knows their lines and their cues. The real intimacy, the real passion, is all in the subtext, in the spaces between the words. And this wasn't just for the nobles. The ideas of courtly love trickled down to the lower classes, too. Peasants who might not have had the luxury of a lute or a poet would still have their own ways of signaling affection. A small gift, a flower, a carved piece of wood, these were their tokens of love. And their songs were probably a lot more direct, a lot less metaphorical. No one had time for a lot of metaphorical poetry when they had to get up at dawn to work in the fields. A song for them might have just been about a girl named Mary, who was really good at milking cows, and a boy named John, who was smitten with her. No roses, no nightingales, just two people who liked each other a lot. The heart, you see, finds a way to express itself, no matter how humble the circumstances. So as the silent room presses in on you, you can still feel the echoes of those distant songs. The knight's ode to his lady, the troubadour's ballad, the simple ditty of the peasant boy. All of them, in their own way, were attempts to express something that is at once the most common and the most mysterious part of the human experience. They were all trying to find a language for love, a way to whisper something that the whole world could hear, even if only a few people could truly understand. And that, my friend, is a tradition that has never, ever gone out of style. The straw beneath you rustles as you shift a sound that has become the soundtrack to your journey through the past. The echoes of courtly love fade, replaced by a much more grounded and frankly more awkward reality. You're no longer in a world of poetic romance and secret codes. You're in a world of contracts, of land of alliances. You're in a world where marriage isn't about love, not really. It's about practicality. You see, a mainstream historical fact is that for most of the medieval period, especially among the nobility, marriage was a political and economic transaction. It wasn't about two people falling in love and deciding to spend their lives together. It was about two families or two kingdoms forming an alliance. The bride was often a pawn, a valuable piece on the chessboard of power. She was a link between two powerful houses, and her dowry, the money land, or goods she brought to the marriage was a critical part of the deal. So as you lie here, you can almost hear the low murmur of negotiations of fathers and uncles haggling over acres of land and the number of servants a new bride would bring with her. It's a bit like a medieval real estate deal with a human being as a part of the property transfer. A light joke here, but imagine the conversation. My daughter is strong and healthy, and she comes with 2 fine horses and a whole vineyard. I'll offer you a son who can read and a small tract of forest. Plus, he's only got one eye, so he's less likely to look at other women. A tough sell right. But this was the reality. The feelings of the people involved were, for the most part, a secondary concern. But what about the common folk, the peasants and the artisans? They weren't marrying for political alliances, were they? Well, not exactly, but their marriages were just as practical. A quirky historical tidbit is that for peasants, a marriage was often a union of labor and resources. A man needed a wife to help with the fields, to tend the animals, to manage the household. A woman needed a husband for protection and to provide for her and her children. They were a team, a small economic unit. They were marrying for survival, not for romance. And their love, if it grew, was a byproduct of that shared struggle. It was the quiet affection that develops when you've been through a plague, a famine, and a cold winter together. It was a love forged in the fire of daily life. And yet even in this practical world there was room for passion. The whispers you hear in this bedchamber, they weren't just about the harvest or the price of wool. They were also about the deep emotional bonds that could grow between two people, even if they were brought together by a contract. The church, for all its rules, also stressed the sanctity of marriage. It was a sacrament, a holy union. So while the marriage might have started as a contract, it was also expected to become a loving partnership. The expectation was that love would grow out of duty, that the practicality of the arrangement would over time give way to a deeper connection. This leads to a classic scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people were capable of the kind of passionate love we associate with modern romance. Was a marriage of convenience just that, a loveless arrangement? Or did people find ways to love each other in spite of the circumstances? We have a few hints. We have love poems and songs that were written for spouses, not just for courtly love affairs. We have wills that leave money and property to a beloved wife or husband even when there were other family members who might have had a stronger claim. These are small clues, but they suggest that passion and affection were very much a part of medieval marriage, even if they weren't the reason for the marriage in the first place. So as you lie here, you can feel the warmth of the person next to you. It might be the warmth of a stranger you were forced to marry, or it might be the warmth of a beloved partner you've shared a life with. The line between the two, you realize, was probably a lot blurrier than we think. The wedding vows might have been a formality, but the life that followed was a messy human affair full of joy and sadness, shared work and quiet moments of affection. It was a life where you learned to love the person you were with, not because of a grand romantic gesture, but because they were the one who was there night after night in the dark. And in a way, isn't that just as romantic? The cold air, a constant companion in this stone room, seems to carry the scent of a different kind of magic now. You're moving from the realm of contracts and politics to a world that hums with the power of nature and the whispers of ancient beliefs. This is a world where love isn't just an emotion. It's a force that can be manipulated, summoned, and protected with herbs, potions, and a little bit of magic. You're entering the fascinating and sometimes a little bit ridiculous world of medieval folk remedies for love and fertility. Imagine a young woman, perhaps a servant girl or a peasant's daughter, who has a crush on the village blacksmith. She can't just go up to him and ask him out. Society is too rigid for that. Instead, she might turn to an older woman in the village, a wise woman, or a cunning woman, as they were sometimes called. This woman isn't a witch in the scary broomstick-riding sense. She's more like a village herbalist, a folk doctor who knows the secrets of the forest and the field. Her advice might sound a little out there to our modern ears. A quirky historical tidbit for you to attract a man, a girl, might be told to gather a certain herb, like vervain or periwinkle, on a specific night of the new moon. She would then put the herb in a small pouch, sew it into her clothing, and hope that its magical properties would draw him to her. It's a bit like a medieval charm, a quiet, personal ritual. Maybe you're also told to wear something red, the color of passion, or to sing a certain song while you're doing it. The point is, there was an action, a ritual, and a deep belief that these things could influence the most powerful of human emotions. But it wasn't just about finding love, it was also about keeping it, and perhaps more importantly, about having children. A mainstream historical fact is that in a world without modern medicine, fertility was a constant concern. A child was not just a blessing, they were a source of labor, a means of supporting you in your old age, and a way to ensure your family name continued. So in the bedroom, a lot of the whispered secrets and hopes would have been about having a healthy child. And so people would turn to a different kind of potion. Maybe a brew made of mandrake root, believed to have potent fertility powers, or perhaps a drink made from the blood of a certain animal or the ashes of a burned herb. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in the magical properties of these things, or if it was more about the placebo effect. Did the act of making and consuming the potion give them hope and reduce anxiety, which in turn helped their chances? Or did they truly believe that a mandrake root had some sort of spiritual power? The answer is probably a bit of both. They were living in a world where the line between magic and medicine was incredibly blurry. A prayer to a saint and a sip of a strange brew were not mutually exclusive. They were two different paths to the same desired outcome. You can imagine the scene. A couple lying in this very bed, whispering their hopes for a child. The woman might have a small bag of herbs tied to her waist. The man might have a small amulet under his pillow. They're not just hoping. They're trying to help the process along. And the conversations would be full of these secret rituals. Did you remember to put the rosemary under the bed? The cunning woman said it would help. Yes, but I think the moon is wrong. We have to wait for the next quarter. It was a quiet, shared conspiracy, a way of taking control in a world that was often uncontrollable. And of course, there were potions for the opposite reason. In a world with no birth control, sometimes people wanted to prevent a pregnancy. A light joke. But imagine a medieval version of a drugstore aisle for this stuff. Instead of sleek packaging, you'd have dusty bottles and vials of strange liquids, all with a wink and a promise. The ingredients were often just as bizarre as the ones for fertility herbs, like pennyroyal thought to be an abortifacient, or other concoctions that were more likely to make you sick than to do what you wanted. So as you lie here, you realize that the medieval bedroom wasn't just a place for love. It was a place where hope and fear lived side by side. It was a place where people tried to bend the will of the universe with herbs and rituals to bring love to them and to bring life to the world. It was a place where whispered words were prayers and where a pouch of dried leaves could hold more meaning than a king's ransom. The scent of herbs and the murmurs of folk magic are fading, now replaced by the unmistakable, heavy scent of incense and the sound of bells. You feel the presence of a new authority in the room, one far more powerful than any cunning woman. You're feeling the presence of the church, and you're realizing that even in the most intimate of spaces, the church was there with you, watching, judging, and dictating. A mainstream historical fact, the medieval church had a complex and often contradictory set of rules about physical relationships. On the one hand, marriage was a sacrament, a holy union blessed by God. Procreation within that marriage was seen as a duty, a way to continue the human race and fill the ranks of heaven. But on the other hand, the physical act itself was often viewed with suspicion. It was seen as a sign of man's fallen nature, a base desire that needed to be controlled and regulated. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, with a lot of rules about when and how you were allowed to, well, do. The whispers in this bedchamber, then, would have been a quiet negotiation with these rules. Remember those restrictions from the first section. No sex on feast days, no sex during Lent, no sex on Sundays. The list was long. It was a bit like a medieval version of a calendar app constantly reminding you of what you couldn't do. A light joke here, but you can imagine a medieval couple whispering to each other, "Wait, is it Tuesday?" The priest said, "No, Tuesdays if there's a saint's feast day." It was a lot to keep track of, and it added a layer of guilt and anxiety to a part of life that was already pretty complicated. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this conflict beautifully is the church's stance on different positions during intimacy. Some theologians argued that certain positions were more sinful than others. The missionary position, which was seen as the most natural and procreative, was often the only one officially sanctioned. Any other position was often labeled as lustful, unnatural, or even demonic. This is a level of micromanagement that would make a modern-day HR department blush. Imagine having to worry about eternal damnation because you got a little too creative under the covers. The whispers in the bed would have been full of this kind of anxiety. Are we doing this right? Will God forgive us? It was a heavy burden to carry this fear of getting it wrong. This leads to a really interesting scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these rules were actually followed by the general populace, or if they were just an ideal that was largely ignored. The church had the rules, but did the people listen? We have a lot of evidence from penitential manuals, the little guidebooks priests used to hear confessions, that show us the kinds of sins people were confessing. And it turns out people were confessing to all sorts of sexual transgressions, which suggests that the rules were being broken pretty regularly. The church, for its part, tried to use confession as a way to control behavior. A priest might give a husband and wife a penance, say a certain number of prayers for having sex on a forbidden day. But for the couple in the bed, it was a quiet rebellion, a small act of defiance in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives. So as you lie here, you can feel the tension in the air. The tension between the sacred and the profane, between duty and desire. The whispers in this room weren't just about love or survival. They were about navigating a minefield of religious doctrine, about finding a space for your own humanity in a world that was constantly trying to regulate it. It was a quiet, personal struggle, and the bedroom, for all its lack of privacy, was the main battlefield. It was a place where people tried to reconcile their God-given desires with their God-given faith. And you get the feeling it was a conversation that never truly ended. It was a conversation you are now a part of. The whispers of the church's rules are fading, now replaced by the clanking of metal and the rustle of fine silks. You're no longer in the humble bed of a commoner. You've been transported to a castle, a world of joust tournaments, and the code of chivalry. But even here, in this seemingly noble and romantic world, you'll find that the whispered secrets of the bedchamber were often at odds with the public spectacle of courtly life. Chivalry as a mainstream historical fact was more than just a code of honor in battle. It was a whole system of behavior that dictated how a knight should act both on and off the field. A knight was expected to be brave, loyal, and perhaps most importantly, to protect the innocent and honor women. The stories and songs of the time are full of knights performing heroic deeds in the name of their lady, their muse, their source of inspiration. It's all very romantic on the surface, but look a little closer and you'll see some cracks in the armor. Because while a knight might have been expected to be the chaste and loyal protector of his lady, the reality was often a lot messier. A quirky historical tidbit for you: many knights were expected to go on long military campaigns, leaving their wives and ladies behind for months or even years at a time. The result: a lot of boredom, a lot of loneliness, and a lot of temptation. And let's be honest, not everyone had the moral fortitude of Sir Lancelot. The whispers in the castle, the hushed conversations among servants and ladies-in-waiting would have been full of gossip about who was sleeping with whom, while the lord of the castle was away at war. It's a bit like a medieval soap opera with a lot more swords and a lot less electricity. This brings us to the core conflict: the ideal of chivalry versus the reality of human nature. The knight was supposed to be a pure and virtuous warrior, but he was also just a man with human desires and weaknesses. And so the concept of a secret affair, a forbidden love, became a common and even accepted part of courtly life. Historians still argue whether these affairs were seen as scandalous or if they were an expected part of the social fabric. Was it an open secret that everyone turned a blind eye to? Or was it something that, if discovered, would lead to violence and dishonor? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, depending on the people involved and the power dynamics at play. So you can imagine the scene. A knight has just returned from a long campaign. He's tired, he's wounded, and he's been away from his wife for a long time. They're in bed, and the whispers aren't just about love and passion. They're about the things they've missed, the fears they've had, and maybe even the secrets they've kept. The wife might be worried about his safety, but she might also be wondering if he's been faithful. And the knight, for his part, might be whispering sweet words of devotion, but he might also be thinking about a woman he met in a far-off town, a fleeting affair that helped him get through the long nights of war. The code of chivalry, for all its grand ideals, was often a very public performance. The real messy business of love and desire was what happened behind the curtain, in the quiet moments of the night. The whispers in the bedchamber were a place where the mask could come off, where a knight could stop being a hero and just be a man, and a lady could stop being a muse and just be a woman. It was in these private moments that the true nature of their relationships was revealed, a nature that was a lot less like a fairy tale and a lot more like real life. A life of secrets, of compromises, and of finding a way to love and be loved in a world that was constantly trying to tell you how to feel. The clanking of armor and the high-minded ideals of chivalry are now far behind you. The air in the room, while still cold, feels different. It's heavier with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a smell that speaks not of castles and courts, but of the fields, the forges, and the simple homes of the people who lived in them. You're moving from the elite to the everyday, and you're realizing that love beyond the castle walls was a world of its own, with its own rules, its own struggles, and its own unique beauty. For the vast majority of the medieval population, love wasn't a courtly game. It was a partnership forged in the fires of necessity. A mainstream historical fact is that for peasants, artisans, and other common folk, marriage was as much a union of labor as it was a union of hearts. A man and a woman came together to form a household, to work the land to raise children, and to survive the relentless cycle of seasons. Their love, if it grew, was a quiet, practical thing. It was the love of two people who had to rely on each other for everything. The whispers in this bed would have been about the day's work. Did you finish mending the fence? Is there enough bread for tomorrow? These weren't the grand declarations of courtly poetry, but they were in their own way just as profound. A quirky tidbit that brings this home is the tradition of hand fasting. While not a universally practiced ritual in many parts of the medieval world, especially in places without a strong church presence, a couple could enter into a temporary or trial marriage for a year and a day. They would simply hold hands in front of witnesses, and their commitment was sealed by their word. At the end of the year, they could choose to make it a permanent church-sanctioned marriage, or they could go their separate ways. It's a very practical, very human way of dealing with the realities of life. It's a bit like a medieval long-term test drive before you commit to buying the car. It speaks to a world where personal commitment and community approval held as much weight as a formal contract. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the peasants of the medieval era were more or less emotionally open than their noble counterparts. On the one hand, they weren't constrained by the rigid social codes of courtly love. Their love was more direct, more honest. On the other hand, their lives were so consumed by the struggle for survival that they might not have had the luxury of introspection or grand romantic gestures. The evidence is sparse, as the common folk didn't often leave behind written records of their feelings. But we do have folk songs, and they tell a story of love that is earthy, direct, and often full of heartbreak and longing. They are the honest, unvarnished voice of the people. So as you lie here, you can feel the closeness of this simple life. There's no grand canopy over this bed, no curtains to give you privacy. The people in the room with you, your children, your kin, are a constant reminder of the life you're building. The whispers you exchange with your partner aren't just about your feelings. They're about the collective good. They're about the future of your family, about your hopes for your children, about the simple things that make life bearable. It's a love that is bound by the earth, by the work of your hands, and by the promise you made to each other in the hand-fasting ceremony, a promise that was worth more than any fancy contract. It's a love that is honest, raw, and completely and utterly real. The simple, earthy scents of the peasant's home now seem to dissolve, replaced by a new atmosphere, moist, warm, and rich with the mingled smells of steam soap and human bodies. You've been transported from a private bedchamber to a public space, a medieval bathhouse. And you're about to discover that this wasn't just a place for getting clean. It was a bustling social hub and a place where flirtation, gossip, and even scandal could unfold in a way that was impossible in the rigid confines of a castle or village. For the medieval person, a mainstream historical fact is that public bathing was a common and accepted part of life. Forget what you've seen in Hollywood movies about everyone being perpetually dirty. For a large portion of the Middle Ages, especially in towns and cities, bathhouses or stews, as they were sometimes called, were popular social institutions. They were places where people of all classes could go to relax gossip and escape the cold. Think of it as the medieval version of a spa or a community pool with a lot less chlorine and a lot more, well, other people. A quirky historical tidbit for you bathhouses were often co-ed. Men and women would bathe together sometimes with little or no clothing on. This wasn't necessarily a free-for-all, but it certainly made for a more relaxed and open atmosphere than you would find in a public square or a church. It was a space where the usual social rules and hierarchies were a little bit softer. A servant might find themselves talking to a noble. A merchant's wife might find herself sharing a bench with a peasant woman. It was a great social equalizer. And in this relaxed, intimate setting, it's not hard to imagine a lot of flirting going on. A glance across the steam, a shared joke, a subtle touch. These were the whispers of the bathhouse, the secret signals that could lead to something more. This leads us to a classic scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the bathhouses were, for the most part, respectable social institutions, or if they were thinly veiled fronts for brothels. The term stews itself eventually became a euphemism for a brothel, which tells you something about their reputation. On the one hand, we have records of families going to the baths together and of people genuinely enjoying the social and hygienic benefits. On the other hand, we have plenty of contemporary complaints from moralists and priests who saw them as dens of iniquity, places where all sorts of forbidden relationships could blossom. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. They were likely both things at once, a place for a respectable soak and a place for a clandestine meeting. So as you feel the warmth of the steam on your skin, you can imagine the conversations that would have taken place here. The low murmur of gossip, the cheerful chatter, and the hushed secret whispers between two people who might be meeting here for the first time, or who might be having a secret affair. The bathhouse was a sanctuary of a different kind, a place where the social mask could come off and people could connect on a more personal and perhaps more physical level. It was a place where a knight could be just a man and a lady could be just a woman, and the rules of the world outside could be forgotten, if only for a little while. The echoes of those whispered promises, of those stolen moments, still seem to hang in the steamy air. The steam of the bathhouse is replaced by the cool, crisp air of a grand hall, and the chatter of bathers is silenced by the clear, resonant notes of a lute. You're now a silent observer in a different kind of social space, one where love was less about the body and more about the soul, and where the language of romance was being rewritten in real time. You're hearing the beginnings of what we now think of as romantic music, and it's all thanks to the rise of the troubadours. A mainstream historical fact is that the troubadours were poet-musicians who emerged in the south of France in the 11th and 12th centuries. They were the original singer-songwriters, the medieval rock stars, and their subject matter was almost exclusively love. But not just any love. They sang about fin amour, or courtly love, that idealized, often unconsummated love for a noble lady. They traveled from court to court, performing their songs and poems, and in doing so they created a new cultural phenomenon. Their influence spread throughout Europe, and their style of music and poetry became the blueprint for centuries of romantic expression. A quirky tidbit about the troubadours is that they often used a complex system of coded names for their ladies. Instead of using the lady's real name, which would have been scandalous and dangerous, they would use a senhal, a kind of poetic pseudonym. A lady might be called Maidens, which means my lord, a clever and respectful inversion of gender roles. or she might be given a name that alluded to her family's crest or her personal qualities. It's a bit like a medieval rap battle, with the lyrics full of hidden meanings and insider jokes that only the initiated could understand. These secret names added an air of mystery and intrigue to the whole affair, making the love feel even more forbidden and exciting. This leads us to an interesting scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the troubadours' songs were meant to be taken seriously as expressions of genuine emotion, or if they were more of a sophisticated literary game. Were these poets truly heartbroken and pining for their ladies, or were they just following a set of artistic conventions and showing off their poetic skill? The answer, as is so often the case, is probably a mix of both. For some, the songs were a genuine outlet for powerful emotions. For others, it was a way to gain favor at court, to earn a living and to be a part of the cultural elite. Regardless of their intent, their impact was undeniable. They gave people a language for feelings that had long been relegated to whispers and furtive glances. They made love a public, beautiful, and celebrated art form. So as the lute strings vibrate, and the voice of the troubadour fills the hall, you realize that you're hearing the very beginnings of modern romance. This is where the idea of love as a spiritual quest, as an all-consuming passion, first took root. It was a world of knights and ladies, yes, but it was also a world of poets and singers who had the courage to take the most private of feelings and turn them into something that could be shared, something that could echo through a crowded hall and eventually through the centuries. The whispers of the bedchamber were now for the first time being put to music. The final notes of the troubadour's lute have faded, and the romanticism of their songs is replaced by the grim and often bizarre reality of medieval medicine. You're back in the intimacy of the bedchamber, but this time the whispers are no longer about love or desire. They're about health, about the body, and about the sometimes dangerous advice given for everything from heartbreak to fertility. You're about to hear about the medical mismatches of the medieval world. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was largely based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The belief was that a person's health, both physical and mental, was determined by the balance of these humors. If you were sick, it was because your humors were out of balance. The doctor's job was to restore that balance through a variety of methods, many of which would sound, frankly, insane to us today. So when a couple had a problem, whether it was a lack of passion or a struggle with fertility, the solution was often framed in terms of humor theory. A quirky tidbit that exemplifies this is the advice given for heartbreak. If a person was suffering from a broken heart, they were thought to be suffering from an excess of black bile, the humor associated with melancholy. The recommended cure. Well, it was a bit counterintuitive. A doctor might prescribe a concoction of herbs, but they might also recommend a very specific diet, a vigorous exercise regimen, or even bloodletting, the practice of cutting a vein to release what was thought to be the excess humor. The idea was to literally drain the melancholy out of you. Imagine a medieval lover, heartbroken and weak, having a conversation with their partner about their doctor's advice. He says, "I must bleed the sadness from my heart." It sounds like a bad breakup line, but for them it was a legitimate medical instruction. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more attuned to the psychosomatic nature of illness than we are today. Did they understand in their own way that the mind could affect the body? The advice for heartbreak, while medically dubious, does acknowledge a link between emotion and physical health. It suggests that a problem of the heart could be a problem of the body, and vice versa. It's a very holistic, if deeply flawed approach. The whispers in this room would have been full of these kinds of discussions of a couple trying to make sense of a world where a broken heart was a legitimate medical condition, and the cure might just be a leeches. And what about fertility, that perennial concern of the medieval bedchamber? The advice was just as strange and often just as dangerous. A doctor might tell a woman to consume a powdered concoction of herbs or to bathe in a certain kind of water, but they might also prescribe a number of remedies that were, to put it mildly, deeply unhelpful. For example, some doctors believed that a woman's womb could move around inside her body and that a lack of fertility was a result of a displaced womb. The cure, a smelly fumigation or even a potion that was meant to coax the womb back into its rightful place. It's a bit like trying to solve a complicated plumbing issue with a vague promise and a bad smell. So as you lie here, you realize that the medieval bedchamber was a place of medical hope and despair. It was a place where people tried to make sense of their bodies with the tools they had, and those tools were often a strange mix of folk wisdom, ancient philosophy, and pure superstition. The whispers weren't just about love. They were about health, about life and death, and about the sometimes dangerous journey of trying to create and sustain a family in a world that was both beautiful and terrifyingly fragile. The strange, often dangerous prescriptions of medieval medicine are now a distant memory. The whispers you hear in the room have a new, sharper edge to them. They're no longer about hope or healing. They're about secrets, about a quiet defiance of a world that was trying to tell people who they could and could not love. You're entering the shadowy world of forbidden love, and taboos, a place where the heart and the law were in constant, often violent conflict. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society, heavily influenced by the church, had a rigid set of rules about who could marry whom. You couldn't marry a relative, even a distant one, without a special dispensation. You couldn't marry someone from a different social class without risking a scandal. And perhaps most powerfully, you certainly couldn't be in a same-sex relationship, which was seen as a grave sin, a perversion of the natural order. These rules, while often ignored, cast a long shadow over people's lives, forcing many to live in fear and secrecy. The whispers you hear now would have been full of this fear. We can't be seen together. My father would kill me. Or the priest has found out. We must run. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this conflict is the existence of clandestine marriages. While the church required a public ceremony with witnesses, a lot of couples, for a variety of reasons, chose to get married in secret. These were often considered legally binding, but they were a huge risk. If a secret marriage was discovered, the couple could face harsh penalties from fines to excommunication. But for a couple who couldn't marry openly a noble and a peasant, for example, a clandestine marriage was their only hope. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a way of saying, the law may not recognize our love, but we do. The whispers in the bed would have been full of the plans for such a marriage, of the fear and the excitement of a promise made in secret. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval society was more tolerant of same-sex relationships than the official church doctrine would suggest. While the church condemned them, there is evidence in poetry, in art, and in legal records that these relationships existed and were in some circles accepted. Was the church's condemnation a reflection of reality, or was it an ideal that few people actually lived up to? The whispers you hear in this room might be those of two men or two women, finding a small, quiet space for their love in a world that refused to acknowledge it. Their whispers would have been a language of shared glances, of coded words, of a love that had to be hidden from the world and even from themselves. So as you lie here, you realize that the medieval bedchamber was a place of dangerous secrets. It was a place where love in its many forms had to go underground to survive. It was a place where people chose to risk everything, their reputations, their safety, and their very lives for the chance to be with the person they loved. The whispers you hear now are a testament to the power of that love, a power so strong that it could defy a king, a church, and a society that was trying to extinguish it. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love in its most forbidden forms always finds a way. The whispers of forbidden love are now gone, replaced by a profound and subtle silence. You're lying in the bedchamber again, and you're realizing that the most powerful language of the medieval bedroom wasn't spoken at all. It was a language of the body, of subtle gestures, and of symbolic actions. You're about to learn how people communicated desire in a world where privacy was a luxury and directness was a risk. A mainstream historical fact is that in a world without modern lighting and with beds often shared by multiple people, nonverbal cues were essential. A gentle touch, a hand resting on a shoulder, a foot brushing against another under the covers, these were the whispers of the bedroom. These gestures, which to us might seem innocent, were loaded with meaning. They were a way of asking a question without speaking a word, of testing the waters, of communicating a desire that couldn't be spoken aloud. It was a language of shadows and silence, and it was understood by everyone. A quirky historical tidbit that highlights this is the use of symbolic gifts. A man might give a woman a ribbon or a small carved token, but the gift wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol. A glove, for example, could be a symbol of a promise or a challenge. A ring, even if it wasn't an engagement ring, could be a sign of a deeper commitment. These gifts were a way of communicating a message in public without having to say it out loud. They were a part of the secret language of love, a way of building a private world of meaning in a very public world. Imagine a woman looking at the carved wooden bird on her windowsill and knowing that it means, "I miss you." It's a simple object, but it holds a world of whispered meaning. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more or less emotionally repressed than we are today. On the one hand, they lived in a world of rigid social codes and public scrutiny. On the other hand, their reliance on nonverbal cues and symbolic gestures suggests a deep emotional literacy, a way of communicating complex feelings without having to resort to words. Was their silence a sign of repression, or was it a sign of sophistication? The answer is probably a bit of both. They were masters of communication, but their communication was often done in a code that we can only now begin to understand. So as you lie here, you begin to pay attention to the silence, the quiet breathing of the person next to you, the subtle shift of a hand, a shoulder, a leg. You realize that you're hearing the most intimate conversation of all. It's a conversation that is happening in the dark without words, and it's telling you everything you need to know. It's the language of the bedroom, and it's as old as time itself. The silent language of the bedroom has now been muted by a new presence, one that is as inevitable and universal as love itself. You feel a chill in the room that has nothing to do with the night air. It's the chill of loss of endings and of the profound sadness that comes when love is taken away by the ultimate force, death. You're now a witness to how death and disease shaped medieval relationships and the public rituals of mourning. A mainstream historical fact is that in the medieval world, death was an ever-present part of life. Plagues, famines, and wars meant that lifespans were short, and the death of a spouse, a child, or a loved one was a common and often expected tragedy. In the bedchamber, the whispers were not just of love, but of farewells. A man or a woman lying on their deathbed, surrounded by their family, would be whispering their last words, their last wishes, and their last confessions. These were moments of immense gravity, and they shaped the lives of the survivors in profound ways. The quiet promises made in the dark were now being fulfilled, not in a life of shared joy, but in a life of shared grief. A quirky historical tidbit that illustrates this is the practice of having a death mask made of a loved one's face. While this was a practice that existed for centuries in the medieval period, it took on a special significance. It was a way of preserving the memory of the deceased, of holding on to their physical form for a little while longer. The death mask was a reminder of the love that was lost, and it was a powerful, if grim, symbol of a relationship that had been ended too soon. Imagine a grieving spouse holding a mask of their loved one's face, whispering to it in the middle of the night. It's a testament to the fact that for them, love did not end with death. It just took on a new, more painful form. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether medieval people mourned in a way that was more or less performative than we do today. On the one hand, public mourning was a highly ritualized affair with specific clothing, public displays of grief, and a prescribed set of prayers and ceremonies. On the other hand, the deep, personal grief of a spouse who had lost their partner was a very real and very human emotion. Was the public display of grief a genuine reflection of their feelings, or was it a social expectation, a performance of what was expected of them? The answer, as is so often the case, is probably a bit of both. They were living in a world where personal and public were deeply intertwined, and their grief was both a private heartbreak and a public spectacle. So as you lie here, you can feel the quiet sadness of the room. The bed, which was once a place of love, and life is now a place of loss and memory. The whispers you hear are of a different kind. They are the whispers of memory of a life that was and of a love that endures even in the face of death. They are a reminder that the medieval bedchamber, for all its secrets and all its joys, was also the place where a final, painful farewell was said. The finality of those mournful whispers lingers, but as you lie here, a different kind of silence settles over the room. It's not the silence of death, but the quiet of reflection. The straw mattress still rustles, the cold still bites, but the past, for all its strangeness, no longer feels so distant. You're now at the end of your journey, and you're realizing that our modern notions of love are both surprisingly different from and wonderfully similar to their medieval counterparts. A mainstream historical fact, we now live in a world where love is almost universally seen as the primary reason for marriage. The idea of marrying for a political alliance or a land deal is something we see in movies, not in our own lives. We marry for love, for companionship, for a partner to share our life with. This is a profound difference from the medieval world where love was often the consequence of a marriage, not the cause. We have elevated love to a sacred, almost untouchable status. And in doing so, we have in a way made our lives both simpler and more complicated. A quirky tidbit that highlights this shift is our modern fascination with romantic gestures. We love a grand gesture, a proposal at a sporting event, a flash mob, a surprise trip. We see it as the ultimate expression of love. But in the medieval world, a truly grand gesture Might have been something as simple as a husband bringing his wife a rare piece of fruit, or a knight choosing to leave a military campaign early to be with his family. Our grand gestures are public and performative. Theirs were often small, quiet, and deeply personal. It's a bit like comparing a fireworks show to a single, beautifully lit candle. Both are beautiful, but they convey a very different kind of message. And this brings us to a final scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether we in our modern world are truly more in love than our medieval ancestors. We have more freedom, more choice, and more opportunities for love. But we also have more distractions, more pressure, and more ways to fail. Were they, for all their struggles and all their lack of freedom, more deeply connected to their partners because they had to be? Did these shared struggles of plague, famine, and war forge a deeper, more enduring bond than our modern world of convenience and comfort can? The answer is probably something we will never know, but it's a question worth asking. The fire is now just a faint red glow, a single eye winking in the dark. The straw mattress is no longer uncomfortable. It's a part of you now, a part of the story. You are no longer a modern person in a medieval bed. You are a soul who has witnessed a different time, a different way of loving. You have heard the whispers of hope and fear of practicality and passion of life and death. And in those whispers you have found a part of yourself. Slowly, the sensation of the straw mattress fades. The chill in the air softens, and the sounds of the distant past grow faint. The shadows in the room no longer dance. They simply exist, a comforting blanket of darkness. The scent of wood smoke is replaced by the familiar, clean smell of your own bed. The distant howl of a dog is now just the gentle hum of a fan. The world you are in, with all its secrets and its sorrows, is receding, a dream fading back into the mists of history. You are safe. You are warm. The stories of those medieval lovers, with all their hopes and all their hardships, have come to an end. Their whispers, once so clear, are now just a soft echo in your mind. The journey is over. It's time to rest now. Sweet dreams.